Hi everyone. In general, the law of the European Union applies to all 27 member states. However, occasionally member states negotiate certain opt-outs or opt-ins to or from legislation or treaties, meaning they do not have to participate in certain policy areas, regardless of what laws the EU may put in place. Currently, only 3 member states have such opt-outs or opt-ins: Denmark 2, Ireland 2 and Poland 1. So when laws are enacted at an EU level in the areas of freedom, security or justice, which includes immigration and asylum, Ireland is not legally bound by any such laws unless we specifically and voluntarily opt into those laws, noting that Ireland negotiated this opt-in provision, referred to as Protocol 21, in 1997, and it was retained as part of the Treaty of Lisbon. On the screen you can see an extract taken right now from the European Commission website which confirms that there is no EU obligation for Ireland to take in refugees, as it has an opt-in or an opt-out clause on individual proposals in the areas of freedom, security and justice through the EU Treaty of Lisbon. The Irish government has decided to opt into the Pact on Migration and Asylum. On the 26th of June 2024, members of the 33rd Dáil voted to opt Ireland into the EU Migration Pact, with 79 TDs voting in favour and 72 TDs voting against the Pact. You may also recall that 151 out of 159 TDs entitled to vote on the Pact showed up to cast their vote, whereas less than 10 TDs showed up to debate the Pact, again illustrating the contempt Irish politicians have for the Irish people and the sovereignty of this country. Thereafter, in July 2024, the Irish government formally confirmed Ireland's opt-in to the EU Migration Pact to the European Commission. Ireland now has until June 2026 to enact the necessary domestic legislation to allow the EU Migration Pact to become operational in Ireland under European law. Since June of 2024, there has been silence from the Irish government regarding the Pact. Then, on the 17th of March 2025, Conor McGregor declared that Ireland has a mass, unvetted, uncontrolled immigration problem, and that should he run and be elected President of Ireland, he would do all in his power to challenge the implementation of the EU Migration Pact. This public announcement sent shockwaves through the Irish establishment, and as a result, the Irish government appear to be accelerating their plans to implement the Pact in Ireland. On the 25th of March 2025, the Minister for Justice, Jim O'Callaghan, confirmed that he had secured government approval to submit Ireland's national implementation plan for the EU Asylum and Migration Pact to the European Commission, with the Minister of State for Migration, Colm Brophy, stating that we are not waiting for June 2026 to make changes to our system. On the 26th of March 2025, the Department of Justice published Ireland's National Implementation Plan for the EU Migration and Asylum Pact. Now, before I summarise the plan, I want to briefly explain why Ireland opting into the Pact will change the landscape of this country forever. Firstly, Ireland has opted into 7 different pieces of legislation as listed on the screen. In brief, these regulations will 1. Modify some of the criteria for determining the member state responsible for examining an application for international protection, therefore leading to the repeal of the Dublin regulations. Broadly speaking, the Dublin regulations stipulate that the first safe country that an asylum seeker arrives in is responsible for processing that person's asylum claim. Noting that Ireland, given our geographical location, benefits more from this regulation than any other country, because it quite likely is the case that a person will have made an application for international protection in another EU country before journeying to Ireland, thus giving us the legal right to transfer that person back to the other country. 2. To establish what is called a solidarity mechanism to support member states who receive more asylum claims than others due to their geographical locations. The net effect of this is that Ireland will have to accept relocation of a minimum quota of asylum seekers annually from other member states, regardless of the fact that Ireland is not the first member state that the applicant entered, or if Ireland decides that it cannot accept its quota of asylum seekers annually, we would have to pay a fine of €20,000 per person. 3. It will become more difficult to return asylum seekers to other safe countries, as the rules around returns will become more restrictive, including that we will only be able to return applicants to countries which guarantee that the applicant will be given access to an adequate standard of living, healthcare and education, noting that no such guarantees exist for Irish citizens. 4. Ireland will lose the ability to designate countries as being safe countries because the EU will have the authority to overrule any decision we make in this regard. And 5. If another member state claims to be under particular migratory pressure, they can ask the EU that no other member state, including Ireland, return any asylum seekers to them for a period of up to 12 months. The crux is that the EU Migration Pact represents a dangerous erosion of sovereignty, such that Ireland's migration policy and decision making will be ceded to the EU, and in particular the fact that we will be locked into a system whereby the EU can legally dictate the number of migrants Ireland must accept every single year or become subject to massive fines. Now we will take a brief look at the implementation plan itself. While the plan is naturally crafted in positive language to garner support, there is still no avoiding the implications of some of the measures, with the overview of the EU Migration and Asylum Pact section confirming that it will significantly reform the current approach to migration and asylum, both in Ireland and across the EU, which is code for a complete dilution of national sovereignty. Provide a consistent and sustainable asylum procedure, including in times of migratory pressure and crisis, and ensure a fair sharing of responsibility, which is code for the EU will dictate the number of migrants Ireland must have to take to lessen the burden on other countries without having any concern for the impact on Ireland. Under Background to Ireland's National Implementation Plan, it confirms that the government has liaised with numerous stakeholders including the Department of Social Protection, the Department of Education, Attorney General's Office, HSE as well as civil society groups, NGOs and the UN and EU bodies. Firstly, a significant percentage of NGO funding comes from the government itself. However, exact figures are no longer readily available as the only organisation that provided independent data on NGO funding sources, Benefax, which was established in 2014, had all of its government funding removed in 2022. So the last report we have from Benefax is in 2021, which confirmed that Irish governments were funding NGOs to the tune of €6.2 billion annually. So the term NGO is not only misleading but deceptive, given that a majority of the influential NGOs operating in Ireland are actually government-funded organisations. Secondly, the main body that should have been consulted on the EU Migration Pact is the Irish people. But not only were the Irish people ignored, anyone who questioned the government's intention to opt into the pact was cancelled, ridiculed and labelled a racist. The plan also confirms that the government cannot predict the number of persons that will enter Ireland under the pact, so they are preparing for up to 24,000 people to arrive on an annual basis. The next section of the plan is a startling confession, but nevertheless a confession that had to be made at some point, wherein the government confirmed their predicted annual cost for implementing the plan. Under National Implementation Plan and Projected Costings, the plan states the following. Assuming only 15,000 asylum seekers arrive in Ireland per year, the total administrator cost will be approximately €117 million per year. Now, this is just the cost to administer the paperwork. Then the proposed set-up cost to provide 14,000 state-owned beds will be an additional €875 million. Now, this is just the cost to set up the infrastructure for the 14,000 beds. Then the indicative annual running cost for these 14,000 state-owned beds is €725 million per year. Then there is the IT costs, which they say they cannot estimate and instead state will require a multi-annual and multi-million euro investment. The plan then goes on to say that, in addition to these costs, it must be acknowledged that in the short term, the cost to the state in relation to international protection processing will increase as two parallel legislative systems will need to operate for some time. So a couple of points to note on the cost just mentioned. Firstly, the government acknowledged that we could see 24,000 people arrive on an annual basis, whereas the costings they have published are for between 14,000 and 15,000 arrivals. So to begin with, their figures are, politely putting it, misleading. Now, using their figures, on year one, the minimum cost to the taxpayer to accommodate 14,000 to 15,000 people would be €1.7 billion without including IT costs. To put the overall costs into true perspective, on the screen I've included the potential year one costs if these numbers were to increase to 30,000 people. The main problem being that we just don't know how much this is going to cost the Irish taxpayer because we really don't know how many people are going to arrive on an annual basis. but needless to say, the level of funding required to set up and maintain this system is going to be extortionate. And just to clarify that this figure is on top of the €2 billion cost to accommodate, etc., Ukrainians in 2023 and 2024 respectively. Finally, under the plan, the government confirmed that they intend to submit the general scheme of the new legislation for ministerial and government approval sometime in April 2025, while stating that the bill itself should be drafted and published by the end of 2025 and enacted and operational by June 2026. However, given what I stated earlier in relation to Conor McGregor's potential run for the presidency, they may try to accelerate this process. As I have stated over the past couple of years, the implications of Ireland signing up to the EU Migration Pact cannot be overstated, in that the erosion of sovereignty and the ceding of power and control to the EU around Ireland's immigration policy may be irreversible. A country who has no control over who it allows or refuses into its country cannot claim to be sovereign. I will continue to keep you updated as any new information is published, and thanks for listening.